Morgan Stanley under heat from the Department of Justice that, according to the Wall Street Journal, are these government investigations of the major banks spreading? Is this the tip of the iceberg? A lot of analysis on what this means for people that are thinking of investing in these big banks. Paul and Monica joining us now to talk about that. I mean, this is much bigger than the reported investigation, which hasn't been confirmed by the Department of Justice, into Morgan Stanley. So let's just talk about it. We have Goldman Sachs and now reports of investigations into Morgan Stanley. Paul, what's the broader implication here?
I think it seems safe to think that regulators are looking at all of the major banks, so this is probably not the last time we're going to hear about the specific Morgan probe, as well as investigations probably into other big banks. And I think that's a bad sign for anyone that may be thinking that the worst is over for some of the big bank stocks.
What's also important to note is that from sources, with clear knowledge of the situation, all of the big banks got subpoenas from the SEC months ago. When the SEC was looking into Goldman, they were also looking into all of Goldman's competitors, all the big banks, both the commercial banks as well as the banks like Goldman and Morgan Stanley. So all of these banks have had to provide information to the SEC, but we've only seen SEC charges against Goldman.
Yeah, I mean, I think, these investigations typically are very slow, deliberate processes, as well they should be. You can't go out and leak the beginnings of your investigation if you really don't have much of a foot to stand on. That doesn't do anyone at any of the federal agencies any good. So I think even though we may not know just yet how many other big banks are being investigated, that doesn't mean that they're not being investigated.
You have these transactions valued at about $200 million each. Morgan helped form the transactions and said, we want to be on the short side of these. Someone else was on the long side. Morgan made about $400 million as a result. They lost about $10 billion in 2007, all in on their mortgage bets.
Exactly.
So that's what happened here. But yet there's an alleged investigation into it.
Right. Yeah, I guess the analogy would be that, based on what we're hearing, Morgan may have been more like Paulson, the hedge fund that was also in the Goldman probe for betting against these securities. And again, there's nothing illegal about betting that a certain security will fall in value. What I think is important here is that even if the big banks get off scot-free and there's no merit or not enough proof that any of the federal regulators can have to say that there were laws broken, the simple fact is that it doesn't feel right, and that's going to be probably enough for some of the people in Congress to really continue agitating for stricter reform. I don't think the bar is as high. You don't have to prove that Goldman or Morgan broke a law. All you have to prove in terms of Congress to cry out for stricter reforms is that these guys were basically betting against America, as ridiculously simplistic as that sounds.
Could this be a case of overzealous prosecution, Paul?
Oh, it definitely could. I mean, I think you might even, it wouldn't be too inflammatory to say it might even be a witch hunt. I think that, the banks are an easy target. Who's really, other than bankers, who's going to have sympathy for Lloyd Blankfein and Goldman Sachs and everyone making these very large bonuses? It's not that difficult. If I were a senator looking to get votes, yeah, I'd probably beat up on the big banks too. I mean, that's no secret. But that, to be cynical, yes, Washington failed. They're trying to correct that now. Are they really actually correcting it, or stumping for votes and hoping to deflect some of the criticism that rightly should come their way? That's another story. But I do think, though, that just because there is this political risk out there, that is sufficient enough to probably scare away some investors who might be thinking that the worst is over for Goldman, Morgan, et cetera.
All right, Paul, much more on this, of course, in your column, but also, we should just note, no word yet on whether there is or isn't an investigation against Morgan Stanley. Waiting to hear from the Department of Justice on that one, following whether there may or may not be a settlement with Goldman as well, and seeing what other banks might come into the picture. A lot to look at, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you.